Katie from Nerd Church here. This is the second part in my attempt to explain to CJ Cornwait and anybody else who cares why there are so few Catholic religious scholars. I laid out part of it in terms of my own biography, and then I'm going to kind of just work backwards and work forwards. We might be jumping around in time a little bit, but I kind of need to do this to help you understand things, in part because the Catholic Church, in a lot of ways, sort of functions as a conversation across time. So, something that some weirdo said in 1300 could all of a sudden become relevant this year if somebody grabs onto it and runs with it. That's how we roll. Okay, so I am now, I had just gotten up to the Pius XI, Pius XII papacies, which, kind of corresponded with the not great time in human history. And basically, there was a lot of stuff went down. The Catholic Church saw itself as being in an existential crisis that was very much complicated by the fact that initially Pius XII had been really willing to do business with Mussolini because Mussolini was willing to roll back a lot of anti-clericalism and anti-religion government policies that had been enacted in Italy, because frankly, a lot of the Italian communists were, for good reasons and bad, rabidly anti-religion. For example, like the Freemasons really were running around like Rome with like really offensive parodies of Catholic iconography that were, it was trolling. They were trolling with shitposting memes. Only in the early 19th century, you do that with, placards and slogans and marches instead of memes on the internet. It's the same motivation. So you have this sort of very complicated relationship where the Catholic Church is both trying to protect whoever they can protect, and in some cases, some bishops hid people, and by people, I'm talking about, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Jews, especially Jews, and sometimes they handed them over, and that wasn't great. And at the end of World War II, the Catholic Church kind of sat back and realized that the reforms that had been going on prior to World War II hadn't been enough, because about 12 million people were murdered, and part of that was because of the culture of anti-Semitism that had been fostered by the Catholic Church. And then Pope Pius XII died, and Pope John the 23rd was elected. And he, now Pius XII did a liturgy reform that removed the Good Friday prayer, which required people to pray for the conversion of the Jews. It was just removed. It has since been replaced with a prayer where we specifically acknowledge that Jews have the original covenant, that God still honors that covenant, and we pray for the Jews to fulfill their covenant with God and maintain it in the best way they can. So, to summarize, it's like Jews. It's like, guess what? Guess what? God loves the Jews. And we just want them to keep being awesome, which in this year of our Lord, 2026, is a message that people need to hear. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the 50s. So, John the 23rd great man, loved to eat. Um, he passes away, and the mantle then passes to Pope Paul VI. Now, I should mention that I won't quite say that their conduct during World War II was exemplary, because they and any other Catholic would tell you that exemplary was Maximilian Kolbe, who was murdered in a concentration camp after he offered his life to save the life of another man. Now, in this case, it was a Catholic office. It was a Catholic officer who had been in the Polish army. He died at the age of 92. And Maximilian Kolbe was martyred, and he's now a saint. That's the bar. I will, however, note that Paul VI, after he became Pope, the state of Israel offered him the title of righteous among the nations for the work that he had personally done saving Jews during the Holocaust when he was an archbishop in Italy. And he refused that because, as he put it, the Pope had told him that they were supposed to keep as many people alive as they could, and he was just following orders. If you're going to follow orders, maybe there are some orders you should follow. But I'm talking about Catholic scholarship. But I think that I'm also communicating with you how seismic the post-war period it was for the Catholic Church. In America, this is also where people are moving out to the suburbs. Pope Leo's family is part of that story. You know, he grew up in a nice little house in the suburbs in Chicago because that was what his parents could buy. A lot of people grew up in houses like that. So basically, you have this moment where, like, all of the old certainties are gone because people realize that there's a need for profound reform. And that was supposed to be Vatican II. And now I don't think I mentioned this already, but the other thing that Pius X did, that really affected the trajectory of Catholic scholarship for half a century was he wrote a papal encyclical that I'll break down in another episode in more detail. It's a little more into the weeds. It's on the Vatican website. If you want to find it, just know it's there. And anyway, in this encyclical, he condemned modernism. Now, in the long term, that was actually a good thing, because basically Pius X's definition of modernism was a straw man. It was what he was afraid would happen with modernism. It was essentially, denial of all the load-bearing dogmas, the virgin birth, the resurrection, things like that. Things that no Catholic critical scholar is going to even think about contradicting, because if you do that, then you just aren't Catholic anymore. There are some things that we don't question, not because we're afraid to question them, but because we know that that's there for a really good reason. It's the same reason why it's like, why do you put on your, it's like, well, I don't need a seatbelt. I'm not going to put on my seatbelt. And we're sitting there going, yeah, you could get in an accident. Maybe you should, like, make sure that your, perpetual virginity is in the upright and locked position, and your assumption of the Virgin is firmly fastened around your waist, and the resurrection can inflate into a life preserver in the event of a crash over water. Like, to us, it's like, it's that basic level of, this is just what you do to stay safe. And I'll be running a series on load-bearing dogmas, kind of working forwards in order, and explain the purpose that they serve in the Catholic Church and why I call them load-bearing. But by condemning sort of the extreme, ultimate straw man modernism, Pius X, in the long run, gave Catholic scholars the capacity to say, okay, well, Pius X defined modernism. This isn't that. So I'm fine. It's the same way that Albertus Magnus back in the Middle Ages was into a whole bunch of like weird occult demonological research, but he's a saint. So okay, as long as I don't cross this line, I'm good. So we have that leftward guardrail installed by Pius X, but we don't really have a rightward guardrail installed in terms of theology. Because, and this is super important to remember, in the 1960s, people who were theologically conservative and liturgically conservative were also almost exclusively politically and socially conservative. This has started to change, and one of the big changes of the world in like basically after the year of the two popes, which is the cool way of saying 2012, after the year of the two popes, there started to be more of a break between the people who, like myself, I am incredibly conservative theologically. I'm about as liturgically conservative as you can be and be comfortable with the vernacular Mass. And frankly, I dig the fact that there's some of the prayers that my church does pretty regularly in Latin. I vibe with that. I'm not socially conservative, and I'm not politically conservative. So in the 60s, when you had everything that was tradition on one side and everything that was, we want to change, we want to fix things on the other side, it created this really problematic disconnect for a lot of people because there wasn't a way to say, because the Catholic answer has historically always been syncretism. The Catholic Church has always been both and, as long as no one is getting hurt. It's always both and. So you had this period of chaos in the world wars. You had this reckoning that happened in the 50s and 60s, and then the liturgy changed. So Latin is gone. We've got a vernacular Mass, which required a truly monumental undertaking in terms of translation, because first they had to create the order of the Mass, and then they had to translate that into literally every language. Like, Pope Leo, for example, does not list Quechua among his languages because he doesn't speak it at like a high enough level. However, he is fully capable of offering the Mass in Quechua and then talking to the people in his former diocese in the usual post-Mass chit-chat conversations afterwards, because that's important. So part of where the Catholic scholars went is some of them were being really quiet, like, for example, Jacques Maritain, who was very circumspect in what he said and how he said it. And a lot of the really, like, a lot of the conversations that would brush up against people's conservative sensibilities were happening in rectories, they were happening in seminaries, they were happening in college classes, but they weren't really happening in public. And also, like I said, there was a lot of stuff that was going on with the liturgy. There were big changes. Um, and, so there was just a lot of energy that got poured into, okay, we're going to figure out how to make this work. So, and that's the other thing that I think made Catholicism less attractive to a certain number of scholars is it was so up in the air all of a sudden. It was like, how do you even study that, right? It's like trying to study a lightning strike. It's like trying to hold water in your hand. You can't study the revolution while the revolution is happening. All you can do is document it. Also, at least in the US, Catholicism was both weird and exotic, but at the same time, like, it was familiar enough to be boring. So nobody really got into it, especially since Catholics of my parents' generation, which is also Pope Leo's generation, which is also which is the Paul VI generation. They learned to be circumspect about their religion in public. That's why, like, don't wear your rosary around your neck became a thing, right? That's why, um, people just, towns either quit having their, Easter procession, Easter and Good Friday and Corpus Christi processions, or they, or if they hadn't already had them, they weren't pushing their luck. It was all very, I sometimes think of it as like, like, it's like you go along the row house and, everything looks absolutely the same, but then you open one door and inside it, they've redone their living room to look like the set of the Enterprise. Catholicism in some ways felt like that. It was like everything was open, but at the same time, it was like a secret club that you didn't really talk about. And if that sounds a little bit like, being part of a somewhat esoteric subculture, then yeah, it does. And some people vibed with that, and some people just wanted to be normal. And so there was just a lot of chaos going on. And a lot of people, if they were raised in a progressive family that was happy with Vatican II, and like an older generation will still talk about, oh yeah, this guy's a real Vatican II priest, right? And they mean that as a compliment. This is somebody who's compassionate, who's pastoral, who's progressive, who's willing to welcome everyone. If you were raised in a socially liberal family, you kind of felt like studying all that medieval stuff was studying all that medieval stuff. It was not encouraged. It was something that we had put in the past behind us with the anti-Semitism. And if you were conservative or traditional theologically, liturgically, socially, politically, it was, you were either like disappearing deep into the weeds of the church to start the counter-revolution, or you were, trying to talk to other Catholics to like hold against the breach, or you were disappearing into the church to try to affect change from the inside. But the mode, or you grew up in a really strict, really socially and politically conservative Catholic family, and you just left. And here I'm talking about the 60s and 70s. There was a whole lot of stuff going on. Another thing that happened, and I cannot overstate the importance of this for anyone who is a Catholic woman who was born after Vatican II, and, well, things haven't officially changed yet, was the encyclical Humanae Vitae. Humanae Vitae is the document that says that any form of artificial contraception is unacceptable, that it is immoral. And this was happening at a time when a lot of Catholic women were looking at something like the birth control pill, which had been designed by a Catholic physician for the purpose of helping women who had, for example, polycystic ovarian syndrome and didn't have regular menstrual cycles, could take the pills, and then that would give them a regular 28-day cycle, and then they could effectively count the days of their periods and abstain from sex on their fertile days if they and their husband decided that they didn't want to have a child at the present time. However, it turned out that the birth control pill actually shuts down ovulation entirely. And when it was a new technology, nobody really knew what to do, and a whole lot of people freaked out. And I think part of the reason people freaked out is, honestly, this was a lot of like old Italian guys who had grown up when like honor killing was still a thing, right? Like, the idea that a respectable married woman would need to use artificial contraception as a way of managing her fertility just didn't compute with them, partly because most of these guys weren't talking to women. And in the 70s, it wasn't really enforced, right? It was there, but people felt free to just ignore it, right? And a lot of times a woman might go to her priest for guidance, and the priest would say, okay, in your particular case, I know you, I know your intention, I know your family situation. It would be better if you, just, take birth control pills, and that will help you, regulate your fertility. And then if things change, go for it. You can have more kids. Okay. So this creates this sense of tension because for the first time in Catholic history, women were explicitly told, we don't trust you to regulate your own fertility. And I would point out, St. Augustine gets a whole lot of heat for this, but I think that it's a lot less bad if we look at it from the woman's point of view. Because what St. Augustine said is basically that women do not necessarily owe their husband sex for pleasure. And that sometimes it might actually be better, like really you should only be doing it if you want to have a kid. And that if the husband, but the part in there that made this stick, because it was good for women, is that Augustine said that if a husband approaches his wife with requesting sex that she is uncomfortable with, or that she personally considers immoral, does not wish to engage in, whatever, she's allowed to tell him no. And Augustine's answer to a man who says, well, yeah, but that's my wife, I'm allowed to have sex with her, is you're not allowed to make her sin. You want to sin? Go pay somebody. At least you'll be helping a poor woman put food on her table. So Catholicism had given women the power to say no. Giving women the power to say yes was a little bit stickier, but ultimately, women had felt, at least to some degree, supported and trusted. And even if they had a lot of kids, generally that was valued in their community. Now you're looking at an era where people want to have smaller families, and women have been told that they can't be trusted. So that takes us up to the year of the three popes. The year after I was born, because the year of the three popes is the cool name for the year 1978. Because Paul VI died. And then John Paul I, who explicitly picked his name to indicate that his papacy was going to be a continuation of the papacy of John the 23rd and Paul VI, died after 1 month. I'll get into the history of the papacy in another episode. Are there conspiracy theories but I will throw this spoiler out. Are there conspiracy theories that John Paul I was murdered? Yes, there are. Are they completely wild? Yes, they are. Do some of them involve the Freemasons? Of course they involve the Freemasons. All quality Catholic conspiracy theories involve the Freemasons. It's weird, it's nuts, people need to cut it out. Okay, so the College of Cardinals elect a very young, very charismatic Polish pope, or rather Polish cardinal, who took the name John Paul II in an attempt to show that he too was going to be a continuity candidate. Instead, as it turned out, he was basically somebody who sort of put the brakes on Vatican II. He was like, okay, we've changed enough. We need to take some time and sit down and digest all of this. Now, that might have actually been okay, except that he started pushing really hard on what in America we would call culture war issues. So, contraception, divorce, abortion. Because abortion had been a wedge issue that pulled the Catholic Church closer to the right. Also, John Paul II, for reasons that had everything to do with what was going on in Poland, in that particular era in history, was virulently and rabidly anti-communist, to a point that he was probably not entirely rational on the subject, which had profound effects in Latin America, where people were coming up with what's now called liberation theology, which is basically looking at the Catholic Church and Catholic theology as a tool to help the oppressed. Oscar Romero's a saint. But at the same time, that again made it even more uncomfortable, particularly after when the AIDS crisis happened and the Catholic Church started really, really attacking gay men. And, I've said it before and I'll say it again. If you are a Catholic priest who is living according to his vows of chastity and celibacy, I don't care who you are not having sex with. But the Vatican decided that they cared. So they started, screening out gay men from seminaries. They started kicking lesbian nuns out of convents. People didn't make it past their novitiate. or they didn't make it out of seminary unless they were willing to lie. And a lot of people were not willing to lie. And a lot of Catholics who say didn't have a problem with birth control were, sitting there in the pew not feeling particularly welcome. So what I'm saying is that for anybody who was born during or grew up during the eternal papacy of John Paul II, and I would like to and I just want to lay this out, okay? I was born before the year of the three popes. John Paul was technically my third pope. He's the first pope I actually remember. He's the pope of my childhood. And a lot of Catholics who grew up in that era, unless they were willing to go hard right on every possible issue, and I mean every possible issue, except the liturgy. Because in a lot of churches, especially in America, you ended up with incredible liberalization to the point that it almost felt like Lutheran or like Low Church Anglican, combined with the absolute most conservative, most reactionary Catholic theology and social teaching possible. And for someone like me, and for a lot of my fellow Catholics, that was too much. And we started leaving. And if we went into academia, if we went into scholarship, if we became writers or creators of any kind, we might have still had that Catholic software clicking around in our brains, but that was what had hurt us. They took our identity and made it into a knife. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Allen Ginsberg summed it up. The motto of the 20th century is, I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness. So, anyway, back to chronology. I was born, so John Paul becomes Pope in 1978. He stays Pope until he dies in 2003. Or, no, sorry. He dies in 2003. So basically that means that you have like essentially a full human generation. So someone who was a baby or a toddler when John Paul became Pope was a grown adult with children of their own when John Paul came in. So we have this entire generation of Catholics who basically got really, really, really alienated from the church. And the ones who had a way to stay in very much were working within the church, talking to other Catholics, trying to move the needle, or at least trying to keep things from moving further back. And then we got Benedict. And Benedict was everything John Paul was for good and bad. And he was also a lot less charismatic and a lot less pastoral. And he said he wanted a smaller, purer church. And a lot of people were like, okay, you want the church small? You want the church pure? I'm not here. I'm not coming back. I don't want to carry water for the thing that hurt me. I don't want to explain the history of the thing that hurt me, because ultimately there are things about the Catholic Church that appeal to a lot of Catholics on an emotional and an aesthetic and an experiential level that are really that we were either denied because of a desire to liberalize after Vatican II, or we were told, okay, this exists, but you can't have this because that's traditional, that doesn't belong to you. And a lot of us believed that. So that pretty much wraps up the intellectual history of the Catholic Church. This is the, push factors that within the Catholic Church that pushed people out of Catholic academia and after Catholic scholarship. So that's where we are. And of course, there's, the reason for the cover photo, which is the fact that, Catholic scholarship just hid. It went underground. And what do I mean by that? The cover photo for this is a shrine in a very small, very insignificant parish church to Therese of Lisieux. Therese of Lisieux was the daughter of her mom was a lace maker. Her dad didn't have a great job either. They had 5 daughters. All 5 of them became nuns. Therese died very young of tuberculosis, but before she did, she wrote some plays. She wrote some really good books. She wrote an autobiography. She wrote a lot of letters. She wrote a lot of meditations. And she's called a doctor of the church because she explained things that people needed explained. And because she wasn't around to explain it, there grew up there is an entire cottage industry of just Therese of Lisieux scholars. There are like you could fill a bookcase just on the writings and commentary on the life of Therese of Lisieux. So, if you were a Catholic who was comfortable in the Catholic Church, who was happy in the Catholic Church, who maybe wanted a few things to change, it was a lot safer to just do church history, writing to Catholics, for Catholics, by Catholics, because Protestant scholars cared about the Bible. They didn't care about church history. They didn't care about Therese of Lisieux. But there was still plenty to be said about Therese. And there was still plenty to be said about a lot of people. So that's the other thing that happened. So I hope this has answered some questions. In my final episode, it might not be the final episode. It might be 2 parts. I'm going to talk about some of the things that go on in Catholics in critical scholarship when it's done by Protestants or people who come from a Protestant background that also discourages Catholics from becoming critical scholars. So, I hope you've stuck with me for this long. I apologize if it was a little bit just disjointed and rambly, but this is kind of one of those big questions because in order to explain it, I kind of have to also unpack the, history of the Catholic Church and its discontents in the 20th century. So, have a good one.